Morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're in. Welcome to the Cold War Symposium. I'm John Nelson with the Simon Center program of the Command and General Staff College Foundation, and I'm going to turn it over to the director of the Simon Center, Colonel Retired Bob Ulin.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of presentations commemorating the 30th anniversary of the end of the Cold War. As John indicated, I am the founder and the director of the Simon Center for Ethical Leadership and Interagency Cooperation. The Simon Center is a program of the CGSC Foundation, led by Colonel Retired Rod Cox, who could not join us today. This program is presented thanks to the generosity of our sponsor, Ferguson Development of Liberty, Missouri. John Ferguson has been a long-term supporter of the foundation, and we are grateful for his support. We are also thankful for the support and the guidance of the CGSC Foundation trustees, who willingly give of their time and resources to ensure that we can fulfill our mission of supporting the development of leaders of character and competence at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College for service to the nation in three general areas: scholarship, outreach, and soldier and family support. If you want to learn more about the Simon Center, you can visit us on thesimoncenter.org. We have just completely reorganized the site. We have a lot of new content on there, including a podcast series. Our moderator today for the event is retired Lieutenant Colonel John Nelson, who is a senior research fellow and is the deputy director of the Simon Center. John, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, everyone. I'm going to go through just a couple admin notes. And there we go. Is everybody seeing my screen, the Cold War Symposium splash screen? Okay. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to hit a couple highlights, some admin. The purpose of this symposium is to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the end of the Cold War, to promote scholarship, and to recognize the contributions of those who participated in that global struggle. And this is a symposium overview. We began this process a few weeks ago with a live dinner at June's here in June's Northland here in Leavenworth. We're at the first of three virtual events called Setting the Stage. We have another virtual event, which will be in January. The Cold War Ends. And then in February, we'll be doing another one, Rebuilding the Alliance. And you can see the panel speakers that are contributing to this. You know, the outcome of this whole process, our panel speakers are going to be talking to you about chapters they're going to be putting into a book that is going to be edited by one of the authors, Dr. Mark Wilcox of the Command and General Staff College Foundation. And here's our agenda for today. We're in the process of doing a brief introduction, and I'm doing the introduction, and I'm going to start introducing our panelists here in a moment. And then we'll go with Mr. Tim Riley. We'll follow that up with Colonel Retired John House and Dr. Robert Davis. So we have a full day. And here's our conduct, how we're going to go through it. For each speaker, we're going to have them present for approximately 15 minutes. And for the speakers know this, that as we approach 1 minute, I'm going to hold up the finger and wave. You got 1 minute left. If I get an acknowledgement like a north-south head nod or a thumbs up or something, then I won't say anything. If I don't see anything in the next 4 or 5 minutes, then I'll have to break in audioly. We are going to try to keep everybody tight on that 15 minutes so we don't run out of time at the end. And then we're going to go into a 10-minute question and answer session. The way we'll run the question and answers is that I would like you, instead of breaking in verbally, I'd like you to type all your questions into the chat. And I will moderate the question and answer sections between myself and Dr. Mark Wilcox, our editors. Will select the questions. Hopefully we'll be able to get as many of them in as possible and answer all of your questions. If we can't get to a particular question, I will capture the questions and then I'll send them out to the individual authors separately so we at least can get them answered offline and shared with the community. Are there any questions from anybody about how we're going to go through this process? Well, great. Then without further ado, and I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Mr. Tim Riley is the curator, author, and in-demand lecturer on Winston Churchill and 20th century geopolitical history. He is the director and curator of the nation's Churchill Center. An art historian, Mr. Riley has organized critically acclaimed exhibitions of Churchill's painting throughout the United States. He is a contributing editor of Finest Hour, the Journal of the International Churchill Society. In addition to a degree from Lawrence University, Riley completed graduate study in medieval art history at Columbia University in the city of New York. He was installed as a member of the Association of Churchill Fellows of Westminster College in 2016. Thank you very much, Mr. Riley, and the floor is yours. And I'll go ahead and start your 15-minute timer, sir.
Well, very good. And thank you, everyone. And thank you particularly to the Simon Center for organizing this extraordinary symposium. The lineup of speakers and topics, not only today, but in the sessions to come, are truly outstanding. And I look forward to sharing a few words today to kick things off. I'm going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that? The Iron Curtain speech is the subject of the conversation, or my topic today, and to kick things off, that occurred on the campus of Westminster College here in Fulton, Missouri. I'm actually speaking to you from the Clementine Spencer Churchill Reading Room, the reading room and library at America's National Churchill Museum, not far from the site in the historic gymnasium here on the Westminster campus where Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech 75 years ago. This has been a great celebration this year of marking the milestone of 75 years since the speech occurred. And what I'd like to do today is put the speech in context. Many scholars, historians have argued quite successfully, I believe, that in many ways the speech that Churchill gave in Fulton, Missouri 75 years ago was the marker, the outset of the Cold War, at least the formal declaration. And we're going to look today at the actual speech itself, the text, the narrative, using one of the prized objects in the museum's collection here, the near final draft of the speech itself that Churchill was working on in the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., the night before he boarded the train to come to Fulton with President Truman at his side to deliver the speech. So we're going to be looking at a primary source document, the speech itself, and look really at the power of Churchill's prose. Edward R. Murrow, famously in the Second World War, said that Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Well, he did so again 75 years ago at the Westminster College. But to put things in context, I'd like to take everyone back to the end of World War II. To put the Cold War in context, I think it's appropriate and proper that we begin by looking at the end of the war in Europe, particularly VE Day. The famous photograph on the right of Winston Churchill on the Minister of Health building with his victory salute, with his famous V sign there, addressing the crowd, the masses below, signaling to the crowd, "This is your victory, a victory for all." You've all played your part in World War II, rather, in Europe had ended. The Germans had surrendered, and the great New York Times headline from May 9th, 1945 says that Truman warns that victory is half won. Of course, the theater in the Pacific continues after this. We also know as historians and students of history that there was a meeting of the big three, Joseph Stalin, Harry Truman, who became the third of the big three after Roosevelt's death in April of 1945, and Winston Churchill. This is a photograph of them in the summer of 1945 in Potsdam, right outside of Berlin, where the three leaders met to discuss the next steps immediately following the aftermath of the war in Europe. As many know, the conference was interrupted. Churchill had to go back to England to learn the results of a general election. Americans forget that Churchill won the war, but his party lost an election. Much to Churchill's surprise, his party was voted out of office, and Clement Attlee became the prime minister. So when the Potsdam conference resumed, there was a new cast of characters. Stalin and Truman remained constant, but Attlee is now in the seat once occupied by Winston Churchill. For Churchill, the loss of this election was a devastating blow. His wife Clementine, for whom this library is named, famously said to Winston, Winston, I think this is a blessing in disguise, to which he replied, it's very effectively disguised. Well, notwithstanding, Churchill was without a job, without an office. He elected to relax and recoup his energies after 5 long years of war when he received this letter from Westminster College in October of 1945 from the president of the college, Frank McClure, inviting him to campus here in Fulton to deliver a speech, the John Finley Green Foundation Lecture and Endowed Lectureship at the college. And I'm convinced this lecture would have been passed along to a secretary. Churchill would have said, tell them I can't possibly come, but thank them very much, save for the postscript. And if you look at the below, you can see a handwritten note at the bottom of the page. This is a wonderful school in my home state. Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you. Best regards, Harry Truman. The President of the United States authored this personal plea to Winston Churchill. When Churchill saw that note, he immediately became excited, knowing he would be back in the game, lost the election, but if he were afforded the opportunity to make a speech with the president at his side, he would do so. And so he responded back to Truman, who then in turn alerted Westminster College and the president, Dr. McClure, that he was coming. And the stage was set for Churchill's speech, which was set for March 5th, 1946. Meanwhile, Churchill does what a lot of smart Americans do. In the month of January, he books passage from England and spends a few months in sunny South Florida. Here in Miami Beach, he is showing relaxing, doing one of his favorite pastimes of painting, and begins to craft in his mind the message that he is going to give a few short months later in Fulton. He does so while relaxing. Meanwhile, the college is very interested and eager to find out what Churchill is going to say. They write to him saying, what's the title of your speech? What's your topic? And Churchill replies in January 30th, saying that he will make the arrangements to come soon. His address will be a political pronouncement of considerable importance. That's really all he gives the college as late as the final days of January 1946. By the time Churchill arrives in Fulton on March 5th, 1946, along with President Truman, who is pictured here, living up to his promise to introduce Winston Churchill, Churchill has crafted his message. He knows what he's going to say, and he's going to make an announcement indeed of considerable political importance. And as promised, now we're going to look at the speech itself, the text, the near final draft. This was the document that Churchill was working on in the embassy the night before he boarded the train to Missouri with President Truman. And this is the frontispiece. Here it is. Joe Sturdee, Churchill's private secretary, is the one who authored this frontispiece, the speech. And what you're looking at here are the carbon copies of that speech. You can imagine that Winston Churchill is paging through the originals in the embassy in Washington, making final notes to the speech. And Joe Sturdee, the secretary, is taking notes in shorthand, the final edits for what would become the Sinews of Peace speech, the title of the speech that Churchill gave it, commonly known as the Iron Curtain speech. And it opens in Churchillian fashion by acknowledging his location. He says, "I'm here, pleased to be at Westminster College." He received an honorary degree. And he makes the joke that Westminster is a place that seems somehow familiar to him, of course, referring to the Palace of Westminster and the House of Commons, where he spent most of his life. He then uses, over the next 50 pages of the speech, which will not go into detail in today's talk, but I encourage you to look online at the museum's website for many of the folios in this speech to study them more closely. But in the speech, he acknowledges President Truman. He acknowledges also that as he is coming as a private citizen, he is not a statesman, he does not have any official duties representing Great Britain or the Allies, and he makes, let's let Churchill speak for himself. This is what he says.
Let me, however, make it clear that I have no official mission or status of any kind. I speak only for myself. There is nothing here but what you see.
And of course, you can hear the audience laughing in the gymnasium here at Westminster College because what they see is this picture. They see the statesman, arguably one of the most famous men on earth following World War II, standing at a lectern holding the presidential seal with President Truman behind him. So though he's acting as a private citizen, the world surely knows Churchill's credentials as giving this important speech. He then lays out an argument in his address that there should be an overall strategic concept for the West to secure security and freedom for the world. Churchill was acutely aware that in the aftermath of World War II, there was still an instability in the world, and he uses his speech to really talk about the two great marauders, as he calls them, war and tyranny. He was very well aware, as was the public listening to the speech on the radio or in person in the gymnasium, of the great destruction caused by war. And Churchill begins to lay out in his speech that one of the methods for achieving a permanent speech was to invest in this new organization called the United Nations. And he argues that the UN, in its infancy at this point, or as a child really, is something that ought to be considered as a coalition, that it ought to have an armed force, especially an armed air force, to meet oncoming looming threats. And that's an important thing we should keep in mind, that Churchill, even in the beginning of his Iron Curtain speech, is arguing for a certain military component to the UN. He also goes on to say that the atomic weapons be kept out of the hands of the UN, but really into the hands of the US, Great Britain, and Canada, at least for the short term. He underscores and outlays in the beginning of the speech the nuclear threat. Again, Churchill makes also a case here that the kindred Anglo-American alliance based on a common set of values for freedom and human rights is something that should drive any diplomacy going forward, or any course of action, any blueprint for how to face future threats must be, in his opinion, based in the Constitution of the United States and the shared common values of law through the Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, and as Churchill says in the Iron Curtain speech, all of these find their most famous expression in the Declaration of the American Independence. So Churchill is making an argument that whatever course of action is to be taken is to be done within this shared set of basic title deeds of freedom, as he later calls them. Skipping ahead here, Churchill also talks about the importance of the special relationship. This is a term we use even today And while the phrase had been used before, it was not coined in the Iron Curtain speech. It's certainly given currency in the Iron Curtain speech, that being the relationship between Great Britain and the United States. And he outlines that that should be a military relationship with shared resources, shared military knowledge exchanged back and forth between the two great powers. Churchill underscores that in the opening sections of the Iron Curtain speech. He also talks a little bit goes as far as saying that one day perhaps there would be a shared citizenship between the two countries. That's something, of course, that never materialized, but Churchill, ever the optimist and visionary, was imagining a case where the two great allies would continue to collaborate on a basis that might even called for shared citizenship. Churchill also then talks a little bit about historically some of the things that were threats to peace before and during World War II. And then he begins to turn his attention to the Russian question about halfway through, a little over halfway through the speech. And as one who fought in World War II alongside the ally in Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, here's what he says.
Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies.
So Churchill talks about the fact that Russia is
nobody knows
the next threat. And here's the famous phrase.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
And with that declaration that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, he begins to ramp up his rhetoric and warn that the Soviet Union is in fact the next threat, and that he outlines in the rest of the speech a blueprint that calls for an Anglo-American alliance to stand up to the former ally in the Soviet Union, and really gives the world in this section of the Iron Curtain speech, the last section, a blueprint for how to ultimately wage and ultimately win the Cold War.
Twice,
Tim, we're out on time, sir.
We have seen the United States against their wishes and their traditions, against arguments, the force of which it is impossible, the force of which it is impossible not to comprehend. Twice we have seen them drawn by irresistible forces into these wars in time to secure the victory of the good cause, but only after frightful slaughter and devastation have occurred.
So in conclusion, it's in this preamble that Churchill sets up the context for warning the world that the next threat is in fact the Soviet Union, and that the expanding Communist Party and its doctrines afford the world the next threat. The former ally has turned adversary. And the Iron Curtain speech, above all, is a warning for how the West should, through an alliance, wage and ultimately win the Cold War. And it's really this speech that really we should look to today even to provide a blueprint for creating an argument, for outlining a shared set of common values and alliances to face new and looming threats. And that's exactly what Churchill did in his Iron Curtain speech to provide the sinews of peace that he was always championing. So with that, I'll conclude my formal remarks and we'll turn to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riley. Appreciate that. And just a reminder, if anybody has, when you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat. I'll start off the question and answer section. As you know, the immediate reaction to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was a bit mixed, with many Americans questioning Churchill's warning of the Soviet expansion. So how did the prevailing view shift and the Iron Curtain speech become accepted as prescient?
That's a great question, John. I think, again, as you mentioned, the immediate reaction was mixed. Truman himself distanced himself, saying, "I'd never read the speech. I hadn't seen it." Of course, he had. He had spent an entire train ride from Washington overnight and was very familiar with what Churchill was going to say, though he walked away from it. The Roosevelt family was appalled. Eleanor Roosevelt thought that Churchill was a warmonger calling for World War III. After all, it was Uncle Joe Stalin, who was the ally. And the Soviet people, the Russian people, as Churchill notes in the speech, suffered great losses during World War II. So for many Americans, a statement that the Soviets were the next threat was hard to fathom. That changed, of course, as we saw the oppression and through the occupancy in Berlin, the Berlin Wall, which was not yet built. The Iron Curtain is a metaphor at this point, but would come to pass. And as the Berlin airlift is something that is put into place, the Truman Doctrine a year later, public opinion shifts, and they begin to see that Churchill was in fact right. They begin to see the true colors of Stalin. And the fact that as the Americans and the British went home after World War II, Stalin stayed put. He came in from the East, and that Iron Curtain was a real, in fact, threat. So that did come to pass within a year of the Iron Curtain speech. The Truman Doctrine is in place, following in many ways the blueprint offered by Churchill.
Great, thank you. We do have one question from Dave Nichols, and I'm going to rephrase it because I think I understand what he means, is how this whole questioning of the speech, how was it received in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe?
Well, I think it's very fair to say Stalin hated it. Any pretense of diplomacy that Churchill shared and camaraderie that Churchill shared at Yalta and all the other conferences during the war was lost after March 5th, 1946. Stalin denounced the speech and said that Churchill was wrong and was in fact angling, he thought it an act of aggression. So the tension, the rapid rise in tension between the East and West escalated dramatically. And Churchill knew that. He knew what he was doing. And that was certainly an immediate output. So it's not a surprise, of course, that Stalin is when called out for his true colors, is reacting the way he did.
We have another question here from Mark Wilcox. Churchill highlighted the importance of common values in any course of action. In 1947, George Kennan also invoked the importance of staying true on our values in his X article that laid out the outline of containment. Do you see a continuity between the speech and the article?
I do. I think it's a direct continuity. And I think that, this is it wasn't necessarily a prevailing view at the time, but is one that is definitely there. That's a great point. Great observation.
Okay, one more question I think we have time for. You mentioned during your talk the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom was a phrase that Churchill made popular at Fulton in the speech. What role did that special relationship have in providing a blueprint for how the West, specifically the US and the UK, would ultimately wage war with the Cold War?
Well, I think, ultimately that special relationship was something that Churchill believed in, from his early years as a diplomat. The first decades of the 20th century as a young parliamentarian, Churchill talks about, or the idea of a relationship between the United States and Britain, sharing, again, these common Anglo-American values and codes of law and so forth. It reaches its pinnacle in the Iron Curtain speech, in calling for military alliances. That's really what it spelled, how it's spelled out in the Iron Curtain speech. And that intelligence sharing and military alliance was something that Churchill was very aware of and important during the war, World War II that is, and he was calling for it to continue. Of course, he had something in mind, that the British power in the world view had diminished by that point. The United States was the major player. So in some ways, Churchill is saying, well, for self-sufficiency and for preservation, that it would be a good idea for Britain to latch on to the United States. So there was a certain amount of self-serving there. But the other very real part of this is that both the United States and Britain possessed atomic weapons, and Churchill knew that. And this was a special relationship also militarily. Now, diplomatically, we still use the term special relationship today. Every time there's a new leader in Britain or the United States, a president or prime minister, pundits and authors look at what is the status of the special relationship. It was true when Boris Johnson became president and President Trump. It became true when President Biden was elected. What is the special relationship going to look like? And over the years, that special relationship, whether it be between President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher or other leaders, have really been instrumental to not only how the Cold War began with Truman and Churchill here in Fulton, but also how the Cold War arguably ended, and then we're going to talk more about that with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. The special relationship that Churchill talks about was instrumental. There's no doubt about it, and that's one of the great legacies of the Iron Curtain speech, is that Churchill really gave that phrase not only currency, but also great meaning that is still used today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tim. We have, I just wanted to mention there was a comment that was, a couple comments that were put in the chat that I'd like to call out. One from Scott Farquhar. This is an excellent example of influence operation. Establishing the intellectual framework of a threat, a coalition or alliance against it, and the aspiration goals of the latter. And then Tobias Gibson commented as well, commented on that, as well as the rule of law, free elections, etc. And then we had another question by Lee Kitchen. Unfortunately, Lee, we won't be able to get to that, but I will save it and I will forward that to Mr. Riley separately. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we're going to move along to our next speaker is Dr. John House. And as I bring his slides up, John House is a retired intelligence officer with significant experience in the Department of Defense, Joint Staff, and other agencies, as well as 2 decades teaching history as a civilian. He is the author or co-author of numerous works of military history, most notably Military History of the Cold War in 2 volumes in 2014 and 2020, When Titans Clashed, How the Red Army Stopped Hitler. That was done with David Glantz, the revised edition in 2015, and Intelligence in the State, Analysts and Decision Makers, and that's coming out, I would assume here towards the end of 2021. In addition to a master's degree from the CGSC, House holds a doctorate in history as well as other master's degrees in history and intelligence. And I'm going to bring up John's slides. Let me get to them. Here we go. And I believe you should all be seeing his slides, right? Okay, so Dr. House, you have it.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can I get the next slide, please? As I tried to argue in the introductory meeting, the term Cold War has so many different meanings for different people. It's certainly not cold in the sense that there are hundreds of thousands of combat casualties during the period. And the confrontation between the US and the USSR stretched out all over the world so that it affected a lot of conflicts that weren't directly causally related to the Cold War, such as the Falklands, because they ended up using the same force structure, doctrine, weapons, and so on that had been designed for the US versus USSR. With the partial exception of Japan, the economies of most industrialized nations were distorted by the enormous burden of national defense spending and limited warfare. At least part of the reason I would suggest why the United States declined as an industrial power is that the Cold War siphoned off so many funds that might otherwise have been used to update our industry or re-educate our workforce. Local conflicts, including India versus Pakistan, Israel versus the Arab states, and a host of different conflicts in Africa, most famously and during the Congo, all were magnified and distorted by great power weapons and military aid that they received because of the Cold War. Slide. Tim Riley already addressed Mr. Churchill's perception of this. There are a lot of factors involved that led to this confrontation. Let me just sort of talk about the issues of predispositions, grand strategy, and domestic institutional interests. National leaders, as well as some at least of their advisors, had a predisposition to be wary of each other. Great Britain and the Soviet Union had just barely survived their struggle with the Germans. Stalin and Churchill had spent much of their lives focused on the perceived conflict between capitalism and communism. Although Truman may have been less ideologically driven, he was undoubtedly suspicious of the USSR. And this perceived threat of the Soviet aggression, though, it goes on alongside with a concern about Germany. Stalin and his allies really, I think, were really concerned about maintaining a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. And many Europeans would have agreed with his concern, if not with his solution. In 1946, the French government of Charles de Gaulle signed an alliance with the Soviets for the explicit purpose of preventing German aggression. 2 years later, Britain, France, and the Low Countries all signed a treaty that is still in force today in Brussels for the same purpose. Although Moscow used the Red Army to impose its control over Eastern Europe, the resulting satellite governments were still shared the same concern about preventing a resurgence of German expansionism. It's no coincidence that once Mikhail Gorbachev allowed East Germany to quit the Warsaw Pact in preparation for reunification with the West, the remaining members of the Warsaw Pact simply refused to continue an alliance that didn't deter Germany. So the dichotomy of the Cold War is not just ideological differences, although it certainly is that, but also enduring concerns of collective and individual national security. The confrontation was also in the interest, as I think I mentioned last time, of institutions and groups on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Stalin was able to reward the Communist Party and the Soviet Army with positions in Eastern Europe. Both political parties in the US were deeply involved in using that conflict for their own intentions. Slide, please. There.
Did I get the right one, or am I one advanced?
Coming forward.
There? We're
Next.
back.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry about that. Turning from the causes of the Cold War to the characteristics of that era, the Korean War is an early example of an enduring but often overlooked phenomenon, the independent actions of regional players that intensified and expanded the global rivalry. Time after time, one of the superpowers would assume that its opponent was a monolithic entity that controlled all of its satellites, proxies, allies, whatever you care to call them, and only to be surprised when a regional or local power initiated action based on its own self-interest. The Truman administration found it difficult to believe in 1950 that Stalin would take the risk first of invading South Korea and then of launching the Chinese intervention later that year. In practice, North Korea's Kim Il-sung had persuaded both Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong to allow him to unify the peninsula under his rule. In turn, Mao prepared to intervene long before the US approached the Yalu River, both because he objected to American interference in what he regarded as a Korean civil war, and also because China could gain regional prestige by halting the Americans. Nor was this a unique example of independent actors. I think I mentioned last time, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon persistently asserted what they call linkage. That is, if the Soviet Union wanted diplomatic concessions from the US, then they had to control North Vietnam. But in reality, the wartime leader of North Vietnam, Le Duan, pursued an independent policy of national unification. He was in effect blackmailing the Soviet Union to provide massive military aid, because if they didn't, then they would be humiliated, ridiculed by all the other Soviet nations for failing to support a, quote, war of national liberation, unquote. For its part, between 1965 and 1970, Red China provided an average at any given time of 150,000 air defense, engineer, and signal troops inside North Vietnam to bolster Hanoi's defenses against American bombing. And again, that was all about supporting socialist efforts. Despite its dependence on Soviet economic aid, Fidel Castro's Cuba also pursued an independent foreign policy that often forced the Soviet Union to follow in its wake. Perhaps the most blatant example of this was in Angola. In November of 1975, both South Africa and a US-backed Zaire invaded the newly independent state of Angola, supporting various armed groups in a developing civil war. When the left-leaning government in Luanda appealed for help, Castro sent enough troops and weapons to stave off the invasion, and then steadily over the next 10 years, expanded his commitment to Angola, to the end of which he had more than 5 divisions of Cuban troops with air support. So like North Vietnam, Cuba was in essence blackmailing Moscow to spend billions of dollars, in this case, also provide advisors down to battalion level to the Angolans. Although less expensive to Moscow, Cuban adventurism in places such as Nicaragua and Grenada also complicated Soviet foreign policy. Now, it wasn't entirely one-sided. Castro provided 18,000 troops under Soviet command to defeat the 1977 Somali invasion of Ethiopia. But even there, the Cubans drew the line. For example, they refused to help Ethiopia suppress the Tigray insurgents. And the Tigray insurgents, if you haven't noticed, are still with us again all those years later. Similar instances of supposed client states pursuing independent strategies abound. The Arab defeat in the Six-Day War of 1967 reflected so poorly on the Soviet military efforts that Moscow sent not only weapons and advisors, but complete units of fighter aircraft and air defense missiles to protect Egypt during the so-called war of attrition with Israel. Notice the Soviets were risking armed confrontation and complicating their diplomatic negotiations with the US solely to appear as loyal allies of Egypt. Nor did the Soviets receive much gratitude from their clients for doing this. In 1971, Egyptian President Sadat arrested pro-Soviet officials within his regime and expelled all the Soviet advisors, not the technicians who maintained the equipment, but the tactical and planning advisors. And at the time, because they were convinced that the Egyptians were incompetent militarily, Washington and Tel Aviv concluded that Egypt couldn't fight without those advisors. But in reality, by expelling those advisors, Sadat freed up his own hands so that he could conduct the 1973 Yom Kippur offensive. It was almost as much of a surprise to the Soviets as it was to Israel and the US. Once the war began, Moscow and Washington airlifted arms and ammunition to their Middle Eastern allies, but they didn't have very much control over what the allies did with that weaponry. When Syria began to lose badly, Leonid Brezhnev tried to stop the Israeli advance by an ultimatum directed not to Tel Aviv, but directly to Washington. Remember what I said about thinking that you can control all of your allies. He was willing to risk a nuclear war to protect his clients in the region. And with Nixon distracted by Watergate, it was Secretary of State Kissinger who effectively took the US to Defense Condition 3, recalling B-52s from bombing Vietnam, alerting the 82nd Airborne, generally moving the superpowers into their most extreme confrontation since 1962. Now, those examples are all about independent supposed allies following their own military strategies in ignoring the superpowers. But the same thing is also true of diplomatic concerns. Most obvious example of that is the Federal Republic of Germany. In the late 1980s, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, provided extensive financial aid to bolster the tottering Soviet regime, and above all, to pay for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Germany. As I mentioned, that paved the way not only for the reunification of Germany, but also for the end of the Warsaw Pact. And that policy may have advanced German interests, but I'm not entirely sure it did that for the Soviet's allies. Slide, please. Regional power independence also illustrates a related problem of the Cold War, the necessity of working with governments that were incompatible with the ideology that you supposedly were defending. There's just a list here I could probably spend all day talking about, and there are other examples we could all think of, I think, where they're very unsavory people that where state-to-state relationships were prickly at best, but one side or the other feels they have to support them in order to maintain their strategic situation. And it isn't just the Soviets, of course, who were involved in overthrowing governments. The forcible overthrow of leaders in Guatemala, Iran, Chile, and elsewhere reflected US and sometimes British willingness to put their perceived national interests ahead of respect for democratic policies. Slide, please. If Soviet supposedly friendly governments found it difficult to cooperate, conflict was even more common within a particular regime, especially when the political, military, or intelligence officials disagreed about major policies. Those disagreements were probably inevitable if you're in a state that's been semi-mobilized continuously for half a century, but still it caused an awful lot of friction and stress. The best known case of that is, of course, Douglas MacArthur trying to pursue total victory in Korea when President Truman wanted to avoid escalation. MacArthur was relieved of command not for disagreeing with the administration, but for doing so publicly, communicating with congressmen and journalists in violation of his instructions. Once he got into office as president, Dwight Eisenhower had significant disagreements with his senior generals because he sought to reduce investment in conventional ground forces by relying on nuclear deterrence. President John Kennedy then blamed the chiefs of staff for not warning him about the foolhardy Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. And his brother, Robert Kennedy, blamed the Army for being slow to bail out the Justice Department marshals who had secretly moved James Meredith into the University of Mississippi without bothering to tell the Army that they were doing that. These disagreements led to the Kennedy administration ignoring and isolating the Joint Chiefs. Slide, please. In a very risky manner, particularly during the ensuing missile crisis. The alleged warmongering of the Joint Chiefs in the fall of 1962 is due primarily to the fact that they were following Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's instructions. He had told them at the end of September, get ready for war. And after the White House veered away from a military solution towards negotiations, someone forgot to turn the military off and then blamed them for it. During the crisis itself, McNamara himself misunderstood the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George Anderson, who was trying to reassure him about the conduct of the quarantine of Cuba. McNamara wrongly thought that the Admiral was telling to butt out of military business, and that led to Anderson's premature retirement. This kind of civil military friction at home or in Cuba led to a lingering distrust between senior military officials on the one hand and the Kennedy and Johnson administrations on the other, and that had an awful lot to do with false steps and false policies during Vietnam. Slide, please.
1 minute, John.
Yep. Soviet military civil conflicts were often less viable, but equally significant for the state. Both Stalin and Khrushchev demoted senior officials to keep control over them. Khrushchev, like Eisenhower, cut the defense budget to get more to the public, and that blew up in his faces. So after Khrushchev's fall, Brezhnev sought to placate the military by returning to a centrally directed economy that gave top priority to armaments production. Because of that top priority in the 5-year industrial plans, when Mikhail Gorbachev officially changed Soviet strategy to a defensive orientation, the 5-year plan continued to churn out weapons that contributed to the economic collapse of the USSR. And similar problems occurred that I won't bore you with really, but basically Gorbachev misused and then blamed the military for trying to control disorders within the Soviet Union. Slide, please. The what I'm trying to suggest is it isn't just a question of East versus West and ideological problems. There's an awful lot of economic, political, diplomatic, institutional issues as well. And so the Cold War was enormously expensive in terms of blood and treasure, but it was also a case study, if you will, in Clausewitz's complexities of public policy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. We have a question to kick off from Greg Cook. Yugoslavia also did not toe the communist line early in the Cold War and broke from the Soviet orbit, and Albania later. One factor common to all these unruly satellites is that they themselves liberated themselves and imposed communism upon themselves, as opposed to the Red Army imposing a communist system upon Eastern European countries. Do you think that this was a driving factor?
Well, I think it's a factor. I almost smiled to myself when I saw you raise that question, because that was originally my first bullet on problems of dealings with frictional people, and I decided to cut it out in the interest of time. But yes, obviously, each of the countries, and particularly the farther away you were from Moscow, the safer it was to happen. So that Tito would pursue a semi-independent policy, and Albania could actually be allied with China. But I agree with you.
Okay, we have another question, this time from Dave Nichols. Do you think that the US made it a conscious strategic objective to outspend the USSR in order to win the Cold War?
That's a famous issue of the 1980s, because Mr. Reagan came into power by saying just that. They calculated that the Soviet Union was already spending such a larger proportion of its gross national product on defense that if we simply even tried to get ahead of them, as of course we did in the early 1980s, that would sort of force them into spending themselves into bankruptcy. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, although it's by no means the only problem.
Okay. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned that Mao Zedong planned to intervene in Korea before the United Nations forces approached the Chinese border. The traditional theory is that the Chinese felt threatened with the UN forces when the UN forces came so close to China. What really happened?
Well, yeah, I mean, I alluded to that because recent scholarship has gone back and looked at things. And in fact, at a time when North Korea was winning and the UN forces were losing back in August of 1950, the Chinese started concentrating troops on the border between North Korea and Manchuria. They actually went and found various former nationalist Chinese officers who've been trained by the Americans and had them teach classes to the troops about how Americans fought. And that was at a time when we were confined to the Pusan perimeter and losing the war. So he was all prepared to intervene. I think it was just logistics that caused him to wait until they got close enough so we didn't have a long line of communications to deal with.
Another question for you, John. H.R. McMaster comes to mind in his book earlier, and talking about JFK and Johnson and the Joint Chiefs. And you mentioned the friction between the military and civilians during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Joint Chiefs are usually portrayed as warmongers. So what went wrong?
Well, short answer is the Department of Defense paid attention to it 3 weeks before everybody else did. If you listen to the story about Cuban Missile Crisis, it's always told in the middle of October, this U-2 took these pictures and that's when we got concerned, right? But at the end of September, another U-2 mission had seen various sites and had imaged IL-28s that were nuclear capable bombers in Cuba. And at that point, Robert McNamara told the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the tank, and then he followed it up with a memo the next day, we're probably going to go to war, get ready now. And so the Department of Defense had been cramming, getting ready. Some people have said it's amazing Florida didn't sink into the sea because of all the aircraft we parked down there. And then they moved, as you know, an armored division out of Fort Hood over to Fort Stewart. They got all ready to invade. And then the Kennedy administration decided, well, we're not going to risk a military confrontation. But they because the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor, didn't really communicate that back to his peers because they didn't see eye to eye about things. So in most of the histories, you hear about how the Joint Chiefs of Staff are warmongers. They're basically just following instructions from McNamara.
Okay, great. We have one more question from Dr. Mark Wilcox. You just mentioned the role of the U-2 aircraft in the Cuban Missile Crisis. How well did the U.S. intelligence community do in monitoring the USSR and its activities during the Cold War?
They had a problem with that, a number of problems. Institutionally, they're in the process of transferring U-2s from the CIA to Air Force control, and that inevitably causes some slippage. But also, they're getting a lot of human intelligence reports from inside Cuba about there are Soviet missiles here. But does the average person know the difference between an air defense missile and a surface-to-surface missile? And so it was very, very difficult for just technical reasons like that for the guys on the US side to be sure of what they were looking at. But by the end of September, the imagery interpreters told Secretary McNamara, we think they're building offensive missile sites there, and there's those IL-28s. We need to get ready. And he believed them.
Super. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks a lot, John. I appreciate it. And great job. And we're getting all the virtual clapping going on. I'm going to flip past your slide and get ready to introduce Dr. Robert Davis. He's the Associate Dean of Academics of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He holds a Ph.D. in Modern European History from Ohio University. His publications include The Challenge of Adaptation, the U.S. Army in the Aftermath of Conflict from 1953 to 2000, released in 2008. The Military and the Media, released in 2009. The U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security, which came out in 2 volumes in 2010. NATO, Western Europe, and the Eisenhower Administration. And that was done in the companion to Dwight D. Eisenhower in 2017. And Cold War Infamy, NATO exercise carte blanche in military exercises, political messaging, and strategic impact in 2018. And with that, Dr. Davis, are you ready, sir?
I'm ready to go, John. Thank you. Can you go ahead and advance the next slide?
There you are. And then I assume you want your first.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you to Tim and John for their excellent presentations. Thank you to the Foundation and the Simon Center for putting this great group of presenters together, which I hope to make a modest contribution to. I'm going to pick up the story in the late 1970s, really focus on the 1980s. And I want to kind of set the scene talking about perceptions of the Soviet Union in the United States and the West at that time. In 1983, in March of 1983, President Ronald Reagan confided to his diary, "I'm going to take our case to the people. Only this time we are declassifying some of our reports on the Soviets and can tell the people some frightening facts. The damn media has propagandized our people against our defense plans more than the Russians have. We are dangerously behind the Soviets and getting further behind." I know many of the participants in today's discussion are probably familiar with the Department of Defense series that was published in the 1980s under Caspar Weinberger and his successors, Frank Carlucci and Dick Cheney, Soviet Military Power, which came out 8 different editions between 1981 and 1989, pardon me, ran about 150 pages apiece. There are 1,200 pages of open source material on the formidable size of the Soviet military establishment in the 1980s, produced by the United States Department of Defense, just as President Reagan said, to get the message out there to the American public, to get past the damn propaganda, the news media, to get the facts in front of the American people. And well down to 1990, the Soviet military machine was indeed formidable on paper. It was formidable on the parade ground, but the political control behind it had become increasingly more questionable as the 1980s went on. In 1978, Sir John Hackett and a number of other former NATO hands published The Third World War, looking ahead to a fictional scenario, but one that was informed by NATO discussions of the 1970s about what war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact would look like. And it ended with things went badly for NATO, and it ended with the release of a nuclear weapon over Birmingham. It was sort of grim reading. A lot of people made different and interesting things of it. Dr. Adam Sipe of Texas A&M University wrote a really fascinating piece on all the different audiences in the West and what they made of Hackett that came out in the Journal of Military History back in 2018. But somewhat famously, at the time, it was purportedly on President Carter's nighttime reading pile directly underneath his copy of the Bible. And indeed, there are National Security Council minutes of the Carter administration where they're talking about the Third World War as Hackett and his co-authors present it as a likely scenario. Two much lighter pieces, the 1982 movie Firefox, starring Clint Eastwood, and Tom Clancy's breakthrough novel, Hunt for Red October, which was published by Naval Institute Press and had fairly modest sales until President Ronald Reagan plugged it as a ripping yarn, at which point it went into paperback and became a New York Times bestseller. It really made Tom Clancy's name and launched the techno thriller that many of us are familiar with. I would like to point out that in both Firefox and the Hunt for Red October, high technology is held by the Soviets. In both cases, the Soviets are ahead of us, whether it's in aeronautics or submarine design. It's the Soviets with the superior technology. And then, of course, many of you are familiar with the ABC made-for-television movie where Lawrence, Kansas was destroyed. I guess the Soviets were probably aiming for Fort Leavenworth, and they missed and hit Lawrence instead. I don't think the Soviets had anything particularly against the Jayhawks, but who knows? On 10 October 1983, Ronald Reagan wrote, Columbus Day. In the morning at Camp David, I ran the tape of the movie ABC is running on the air on November 20th. It's called The Day After. It has Lawrence, Kansas wiped out in a nuclear war with Russia. It was powerfully done, all 7 million worth. The movie actor assessing production quality and value. It's very effective and left me powerfully depressed. So far, they haven't sold any of the 25 spot ads scheduled, and I can see why. Whether it will be of help to the anti-nukes or not, I can't say. My own reaction was one of having to do all we can to have a deterrent and to see that there is never a nuclear war. And indeed, 1983 is really kind of a fascinating year in the Reagan presidency as he turns from the perceived ardent Cold Warrior, having launched a massive American military buildup himself to match the Soviets, to one who's increasingly going to commit himself to summit talks with the Soviets once there's leadership in place that he can talk to, and to try to work our way out of the nuclear war. So John, if you can advance to the next slide for me. So in the 1980s, the classic Sovietologist or Kremlinologist would spend a lot of time analyzing who is present above the Lenin Mausoleum on the May Day parade, who carried the funeral bier, as we increasingly did in the 1980s when Andropov and Chernenko passed away. And what was the message given out at the major party congresses? The 26th Party Congress, the 27th Party Congress, and the 28th Party Congress, which ended up being Gorbachev's last. There is a fascinating literature, both from political scientists and we're at the tail end of the Andropov period. And you can see that the gerontocracy there at the May Day parade, those are all Stalinist lieutenants who are still in power, given a 5.5-hour address. That Andropov is at the peak of his power. He was dead 19 months later. As Gorbachev comes to power, everyone looks to the signals from the 27th. And I it's really important to note here the grandiose statue of Lenin behind Gorbachev. As we get into the elements of Soviet demise, there's going to be a lot of debate in the 80s. Pardon me. Do they still really believe in communism or not? And Mikhail Gorbachev was a child of the post-Stalinist Khrushchevian thought. Well, he'd come of age. He was still a committed communist. He was a Leninist. His generation believed, Stalin had corrupted good old Leninism, but if only we can get back to Leninism, maybe we can make the state succeed again. Next slide, please. So, both news and metaphor, the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986, pardon me, became kind of symbolic of the challenges of the Soviet system. This massive military power, which maintained its military might down to the bitter end, despite some attempts at economic reform and changing in budget priorities by Gorbachev in its final years. And then Chernobyl and a number of other problems which had been in the Soviet Union. As I suggested in my 9 November address, one of the questions we have to ask when we talk about the causes of Soviet decline, is it the conditions of the 1970s and 80s that we want to focus on? Or do we want to take this story all the way back to the nature of the Soviet system? I apologize for this cold I've been chasing. Many years ago, I had a chance to visit Rome, and despite the impressiveness of the Capitoline Hill, the Forum, the Colosseum, I was really struck by the Baths of Caracalla, built in the 3rd century AD, and still a very massive monument to the Roman Imperium to this day. One wonders if the concrete entombment of Chernobyl might not end up being the most lasting monument to communist power in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev embarked on his economic reforms and his new openness, perestroika and glasnost. But the problem that he had was identified, I think, early on by a number of observers. But I'll just read a quick paragraph here from Sir John Hackett's novel on the Third World War in 1978. For the time being, the Communist Party apparatus and the secret police were strong enough to keep such movements in check. We're talking here about nationalist movements in the Soviet periphery, but their existence was enough to add powerfully to the worries of the central authorities. The KGB and the party add to the worries of the central authorities. How to reform the system from within. This indeed ended up being Gorbachev's fundamental problem. How, as a believing communist, a committed Leninist, to reform the system when you were afraid of the very power of the military, the KGB, and the Communist Party itself? And Gorbachev's dilemmas proved, from our vantage point, insoluble, despite numerous attempts at the 27th and 28th Party Congresses and the plenums thereafter. He was unable to reform the system from within. Now, Andropov was 75 years old at the 26th Party Congress. When the Soviet Union collapsed or fell apart or was defeated, and we could discuss in 1991, Gorbachev was only 60 years old. Had he been a good Andropov disciple, and he had been brought up in the party by Andropov, had he been a good Stalinist lieutenant of the second generation, foreseeably he might have held on to power for some more years. But he was unwilling to use the instruments at his command, and ultimately his reforms, as I suggest, proved insoluble. I could discuss some of the recent literature on that, including a massive new fascinating research book by Vladislav Subak. But I will, end there with saying perhaps Chernobyl is the ultimate monument to the Soviet system. And I wonder if people 2,000 years hence will walk past that pile of concrete and wonder at it in a slightly different way than we do today when we pass through the Baths of Caracalla and think about what happened to Rome. Thanks, John. I'm all done.
Okay, great. Thanks. Just a reminder, go ahead and put your questions into the chat. I do have one to kick off. During the Reagan administration, there was this perception that he had this grand strategy or policy that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. What's your comment or feeling on that?
Yeah, then we picked up this question, I think, at the end of John's presentation. That argument is still being made and articulated in the American foreign policy, or the historians of American foreign policy community. Willem Bowden at the University of Texas, his LBJ school, has a massive 800-page manuscript coming out on the Reagan administration's grand strategy. Based on how we teach grand strategy in the war colleges in the United States today, I think it is the case that the Reagan administration attempted to articulate a grand strategy, which did look across the elements of national power to put pressure on the Soviet Union. So it's certainly the case that internal to the administration, they did articulate and then follow through on what they thought was a grand strategy. The debate that's raging in the literature right now is really about whether or not, back to the question, did us outspending the Soviets drive them to decline? Again, Zubok's book, which just came out 3 weeks ago, argues that the Soviet military establishment was only spending, and this is still a little contested, but Zubok has been in a lot of both Western and Soviet records, only spending about 15% of its GDP. Now, John brings up another important issue, and I don't know if Zubok has solved this, which is what about the subsidies to the outer empire or the Soviet satellite states? How much did that cost? And we know it was considerable. But Zubok is arguing now in his new book on the Soviet collapse that 15% of GDP committed to the military was within the Soviet context, not the American political context, indefinitely sustainable. That where Gorbachev really misstepped was in his botched economic reforms internally, by taking apart the revenues internal to the state. The party didn't really have any money to launch the reforms he wanted. And then also the kind of double problem that Soviet bookkeeping had never really been honest, of course. And once you tore back the curtain in the late 1980s, a lot of people in the party were able to take advantage of Gorbachev's reforms to pocket money as privatization got going in its early ways. And so I don't think that I currently fall down the case that the Reagan administration outspent the Soviets, and that was the primary cause of their collapse. I think these internal arguments are pretty compelling. Nonetheless, I do believe the Reagan administration, as we in the United States understand articulating grand strategy, did in fact articulate a grand strategy. Maybe I'm sitting on the fence there a little bit, but I'll conclude.
Okay. We have another question from Gregory Cook. Richard Pipes and others posit that the nationalities policy instituted early in the USSR sowed the seeds for its demise. How do you view this argument?
Well, I think there's a lot to that, and it kind of depends. So Zubok is a Russian, post-Soviet Russian historian who's spent most of the last 3 decades in the West. And he sees things from the perspectives of a Russian. Sergei Plokhy, in his book on the August coup, which is probably the most detailed account right now of the coup, gives a lot of pride of place to the nationality issue, especially the 3 Slavic states, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, deciding to part ways. He said, that's really fundamental, and that perception internal to the intelligentsia in Ukraine and Russia both, that they had been failed by the Soviet system and therefore they wanted out of it, is very, very important. Zubok does not agree as much. So if you look at it from the perspective of Ukraine or the Balts, that played a serious role. And I think that nationality question deserves a lot of attention, and Pipes absolutely brought attention to that early. He was, of course, the senior director for national security affairs for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the first 2 years of the Reagan administration. And part of Pipes' analysis of putting pressure on the Soviet Union, in part through the nationality issue, did in fact contribute to the Reagan administration's grand strategy.
Thanks. This is an interesting question because we talk about, I've heard Bob Ulin talk about when the wall came down and kind of caught people by surprise. Did the end of the Cold War surprise the CIA?
Now, so I've been looking at that a lot as I've been reading through the CIA assessments from the late 70s forward, and there are scores or hundreds of them that run to hundreds of pages. Almost everything historians are now arguing contributed to Soviet decline or collapse was identified by the CIA analyst prior to the fall. And there were a number of really good papers written in 88 and 89 that said, Gorbachev's got to be really careful here because he's getting caught between the momentum that his reforms have stoked amongst the intelligentsia and those conservative powers. And they always highlighted the danger really to him of the KGB and the military. And of course, people had the analog of Khrushchev's removal in '64 in their mind. So the CIA had, I think, written some really good analytical pieces by 88 and 89 that pointed to most of the troubles that Gorbachev did, in fact, face in the final 2 years of the Soviet Union. But they're kind of, and I don't want to be cruel here, especially with some of my guest speakers or fellow speakers are on, but they have their classic intelligence analyst nuance to them. So they never really give you a date when anything's going to happen by. They just say it's increasingly likely that Gorbachev will face, institutional resistance from the KGB and the military, which could in fact lead to a coup. And that's, the CIA has that in print by late 1989. But were we surprised in 1991 when things happened? Yes. I think in part because the Bush administration, not surprisingly, their mind was elsewhere. The first Gulf War, of course, had consumed an awful lot of bandwidth in late 1990 and early 1991. We were pushing for an arms control agenda to sort of consolidate the gains of Gorbachev's relatively weak position. And famously, President Bush and Brent Scowcroft are on vacation at Kennebunkport, Maine, when the coup actually happens. The U.S. Ambassador Jack Matlock had just left the country on the 11th August. So you could kind of say that our eyes were off the ball in the immediate sense, while Bob Gates and others could go testify in front of Congress. Hey, we wrote the paper a year or two ago, but they just never were able to get specific enough. And I'll remind it because he just passed away. Bob Jervis has told us many times through the years in his academic work, surprise is inevitable. Even when you can identify most of the factors contributing to a thing, actually predicting a specific date is darn near impossible.
And we have one more question. It's from Scott Farquhar. The centrifugal forces. Well, there was a long one from Mark Wiggins, but the centrifugal forces of nationalism was articulated by Keenan in the long telegram. No? I believe that was, yeah. Concur?
Yeah. And I do, the funny thing about Gorbachev, the good Leninist, identified the nationality problem as one of the serious problems in the Soviet Union, but he didn't want to be a Stalinist. So he didn't want to use Stalin's tools of repression, and that got him in a tight bind. What did it mean to be a good Leninist? And he kept going back to, he'd go on, when he went on vacation in the Crimea, many times he was rereading Lenin in search of an answer. And Lenin didn't answer the question. The Soviet Union never answered the question. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that Gorbachev didn't answer the question. And post-Soviet Russia has the same problem. And I won't say it in a microcosm because you can't talk about Russia as a microcosm, but Russia has not solved its own nationality problem internal to what is the modern day Russian state.
Okay, we got a question here from Mark Wiggins. Sentiment in the US population was pretty well set against the Soviet Union and communism during the Cold War period, whereas today we can't get 10 Americans to agree on what the color of the sky is. What role did our own internal communication, US government and the news media, play in the downfall of the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, Kennan, long before Robert Davis, of course, famously sees this as a competition for ideas. And there's a lot of that in if not in the long telegram, certainly he articulates it in his speeches at the National War College in 1946, and he pursues it when he is the director of policy planning. I think the Eisenhower administration, if you went back and looked at NSC 162.2, which is Eisenhower's national security strategy that's agreed to by the NSC in October of 1953, very much puts a lot of emphasis on the ideological competition and sees this as an ideological contest. We ourselves, after Vietnam, had a lot harder time sticking to a single narrative. But the United States had a hard time articulating a single narrative back in the 1930s. The United States had a hard time articulating a single narrative back in the 1860s, if I remember correctly. I think sometimes we overplay the degree to which there was, a national consensus on meeting the communist menace in the 50s, 60s, more so than now, perhaps. But we were never really, and I think Professor House said this too, we ourselves were never really a unitary actor at any one point in time. And if you go back and look closely, there's always a lot of contested narrative. While we would all like to do it like we did back then, if you look very hard at back then, I think you'll find a lot of opinions at play. George Shultz and Bob Gates have at each other a lot in their memoirs. If you look at what the State Department wanted to do with the Soviet Union in the 1980s versus what the CIA and most of the NSC staff thought about the Soviet Union, there's a pretty wide disparity even within the Reagan administration about how to approach the Soviets.
We got time for one more question. Did the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan hasten its demise? That was from Lee Kitchen.
Well, that's back to the contributory argument about, it's another element I think of, did we outspend them? And I think certainly Professor House may want to lean on this too. Could the Soviets have sustained a 200,000 man effort in Afghanistan for another 10 years? Well, if you maintained tight party controls and use the KGB to clamp down on dissidents a little bit harder, if you wanted to be a good Stalinist, I'm not sure that you couldn't have sustained the effort in Afghanistan a lot longer than they did. Gorbachev absolutely didn't want to be a Stalinist. And so therefore, one of the problems for him is he's got a very different, very unusual for us opinion of use of force. And he kind of wants to get cut back from the use thereof. So I don't know that I would say that I think the decision to commit themselves to Afghanistan irrevocably weakened Soviet power.
Okay, well, that is unfortunately all the time for questions that we have, but we do have another couple questions and I will forward them out. If anybody can take a look at them in the chat and I will get them out to everybody. I wanted to close out with just a reminder before I turn it over to Bob Ulin for final remarks. I wanted to close out with a reminder of when our next event is, and that's the Cold War Ends panel discussion with Doctors Sean Kalick, Mark Wilcox, who also serves as the editor of our upcoming publication, capturing the ideas that are coming out of this symposium, as well as Dr. Gil Bernarbi. And then on 8 February, we have the final of the 3 symposiums or virtual events for the symposium, Colonel Bill Eckhart, Major General Skip Davis, as well as Dr. Les Grau. So I want to thank all of our authors for taking the time today. I want to thank all of our participants for the great questions that you've put into the chat and everybody's attention. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bob Ulin to close out. You're on mute, Bob. Whatever you're saying is brilliant, but you're on mute.
Okay, you hear me? All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. When we launched this project last year, we wanted to tie the faculty in and bring in some other outside experts to pay homage to actually millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who participated in the Cold War. Cold War didn't get a lot of recognition. Most people thought Cold War, nobody dies. Wrong. It was a 44-year contest that was global in scope, had an impact on governments and countries all over the world. It's an important piece of our history, and we at the foundation, with one of our missions to support scholarship, this is a perfect example of how we can reach out to a broader community and help educate them and share the expertise and the of the faculty that we have at the Command General Staff College. So I want to thank you very much for participating. If you have any suggestions or comments about this program, please reach out to us, to John Nelson or myself. Or you could reach the CGSC Foundation at office@cgscf.org. That's office@cgscf.org. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us. That ends our sessions for today. Thank you very much. We look forward to you re-engaging with us, and we'll send out another invitation for the event in January.
Thank you, everybody.